In the heart of the world's largest desert, there is a green scar that refuses to heal. We look at the pyramids and see a monument to human will, but the real story of Egypt is much more profound. The story of the Nile doesn't begin with humans conquering nature. It begins with nature kicking them out of paradise. 10,000 years ago, North Africa wasn't a sea of sand. It was a vast, lush savanna, a garden of massive lakes and wandering herds where nomadic tribes lived scattered across a green horizon. But then, the earth tilted. The rains began to fail. Paradise died. A wall of sand started to swallow the continent. Driven by fear and thirst, these wanderers were herded into a narrow, golden cage, a volatile, swampy river valley, the Nile. This wasn't a choice. It was a desperate struggle for survival. What follows is the story of how climate refugees invented the state, created the first god kings, and built mountains of stone to prove they could outlast the desert. This is the biography of the world's first superpower, a civilization born in a trap that built a legacy to outlive the sands of time. Just as the ancient Egyptians used the most advanced tools of their era to build massive wonders, I use the best AI tools of ours to bring them back to life. That's why today, I'm glad to share ChatLLM by Abacos AI with you. ChatLLM by Abacos AI gives you the world's top AI models in just one place. ChatGPT 5.2, Gemini 3 Pro, Claude Opus 4.6, Grok 4.1, and DeepSeek. If you're unsure which to use, their Root LLM automatically picks the perfect model for your prompt. But it goes way beyond chat. You can generate realistic images and videos using over a dozen elite models like Nano Banana Pro, Grok Imagine, Flux, Sora 2, Runway, and Kling. It also creates professional PowerPoints, humanizes text to bypass AI detectors, and features a powerful Abacos AI Deep Agent that builds full-stack apps and custom AI agents in minutes. For just $10 a month, you get the absolute best models on the market. Forget about paying for dozens of expensive subscriptions. Visit chatllm.abacos.ai or click the link in the description and pinned comment to simplify your workflow. Our story begins when the map of Egypt was a landscape of two faces, the narrow rocky canyons of Upper Egypt in the south and the vast marshy delta of Lower Egypt in the north. For a long time, these two regions moved at the same pace. But by 3300 BCE, the map of Egypt was being simplified. While the north remained a collection of rural districts, the southern horizon was already dominated by rising city-states like Thinis, Nakada, and Hierakonpolis, fueled by a lucrative exchange of goods with distant lands like Mesopotamia. Through alliances and bloody rivalry, these centers merged into the Thinite Confederacy, a powerhouse of southern tribes unified under a single vision. This was the era of the Shadow Kings, Dynasty 0. Leaders began to carve their names into history as absolute rulers. Their walls could no longer contain their ambitions. They needed more land, more wealth, and more control. The warrior kings of Thinis turned their eyes toward the gateway to the Mediterranean, the Delta. The culture of the south began to subsume the north. Fortresses rose where there were once only farms. The era of the god king was about to be written by one man, Narmer. He is the bridge between a collection of warring tribes and the birth of the first nation-state. Egypt's unification was forged in conquest, immortalized by a monument to absolute triumph, the Narmer Palette. Found in the ruins of Hierakonpolis, the Narmer Palette is the world's first masterpiece of political propaganda. On one side, Narmer raises a mace to subdue a kneeling rival. On the reverse, he marches past rows of his fallen enemies. The message was absolute. The unification of the two lands was forged through uncompromising conquest. The intertwined mythical beasts on the stone represent a new, forced harmony. The red crown of the north and the white crown of the south were now one. To lock this conquest in place, Narmer founded a new capital at the junction of the valley and the delta, Memphis. Known as the White Walls, it was a cork in a bottle. From this strategic throne, the first pharaoh could control every grain of wheat and every human soul moving between the north and the south. The cage was closed. Military conquest is a blunt instrument. To rule so many people, the kings needed a revolution of the mind, ma'at. This wasn't just a law, it was the divine personification of truth, justice, and the cosmic balance. The king ceased to be a mere man and became the living incarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed god of the sky. He was now the only bridge between the heavens and the earth. State propaganda convinced people that without the pharaoh, the sun would not rise and the Nile would not flood. Taxes were now a religious act of survival. To pay the state was to keep the universe from collapsing. To manage this divine machine, the gods needed accountants. This was the birth of the scribe, an elite bureaucracy that used the world's first tax system, the following of Horus. By using nilometers, stone wells that measured the river's pulse, scribes could accurately predict the harvest before a single seed was even planted. If the water rose, taxes rose. If the river failed, the king lowered the burden to prevent revolt. Grain surplus that once sat in local villages was now funneled into royal granaries, creating a national safety net. By feeding his people during famine, the pharaoh validated his divine status. With a population fed, controlled, and spiritually bound to their leader, the Egyptian machine was finally set for the greatest architectural leap in human history: the pyramids. Around 2600 BCE, Egypt entered its first golden age, the Old Kingdom. This was the moment the Egyptian state tested the very limits of human capacity. The transition from mud brick to stone was more than an aesthetic choice. It was a declaration of war against time. Under Pharaoh Djoser, the mission fell to his vizier, Imhotep, a genius who served as the king's right hand, overseeing every law and every stone. Imhotep conceived the Saqqara complex by reimagining the traditional flat-topped tombs of the ancestors, the mastaba. By stacking these monumental layers atop one another, he birthed the Step Pyramid, the world's first monumental stone structure. The peak of this machine was the Great Pyramid of Giza. The Diary of Mera, a 4,500-year-old logbook, proves this wasn't the work of slaves, but of a high-precision national workforce. Thousands were fed and coordinated by a state that functioned like a massive corporation, where the pharaoh was the CEO, and the goal was divine order. However, this stability carried the seeds of its own destruction. To ensure their eternal cults, pharaohs granted massive tax exemptions to temples, slowly emptying the state's grain bank. Meanwhile, local governors, the nomarchs, began to hoard power. They stopped being servants of the capital and became local kings, keeping the wealth that once flowed to Memphis. The final blow came from the sky. At the end of Pharaoh Pepi II's 90-year reign, the world was struck by the 4.2K event, a brutal climate shift that dried up rivers and decimated harvests across the entire planet. The Nile failed for decades. The irrigation systems became a graveyard, and with the royal granaries already weakened by corruption, famine swept the valley. When the flood died, so did the pharaoh's godhood. The collapse of Ma'at plunged Egypt into a brutal civil war known as the First Intermediate Period. The centralized state vanished, leaving a power vacuum and a broken world, waiting for a new force to rise from an obscure town in the south, Thebes. If the Old Kingdom was the age of stone, the Middle Kingdom was the era of the human face. After a century of civil war between the north and a rising southern town called Thebes, King Mentuhotep II finally crushed all resistance. Egypt was reborn, but it was psychologically transformed. The illusion of an infallible king was dead. The new order needed a new justification. A revolutionary ideology arose, the king as the shepherd of the people. The shepherd-king ideology reflected a more human and vigilant monarchy. The royal crook was no longer merely a symbol of power, but a tool of care, signaling that the pharaoh's legitimacy now rested on his ability to protect and provide for his people, rather than solely on his divine lineage. This era also saw the democratization of the afterlife. Hope for immortality was no longer a royal monopoly, but a reward for any citizen with a moral life. To fund this stability, Egypt turned to aggressive imperialism. In the south, they built a chain of high-tech fortresses in Nubia to secure the flow of gold. But the greatest victory was hydraulic. Haunted by memories of famine, the state transformed the Fayum oasis into a massive water savings account, creating a nation-scale insurance policy against the river's betrayal. However, this prosperity became a magnet for disaster. Egypt opened its gates to migrants from the Levant, merchants and shepherds known as the Asiatics. At first, they were a controlled engine for the economy, turning cities like Avaris into bustling trade hubs. But as the central government began to splinter, the grip on this immigrant population slipped. It was a Trojan horse. The threat wasn't a failing Nile or rebellious governors. The danger was already inside the gates. These shepherds were becoming masters, carrying technologies the Egyptians had never seen. Weapons that would soon turn the hunters into the hunted. The stability of the Middle Kingdom didn't shatter because of the Nile. It shattered because the borders failed. For the first time, Egypt was conquered. The Hyksos, rulers of foreign lands, infiltrated the delta and seized the throne. To the native Egyptians in the south, this wasn't just a change in leadership. It was the arrival of chaos. The Hyksos brought a technological apocalypse. While Egypt still fought on foot with copper, the invaders utilized the chariot and the composite bow. Egypt was forced to evolve or perish. The conflict turned personal when the Theban king Seqenenre was executed on the front lines. But his death sparked a fire. His successor, Ahmose I, mastered the enemy's own weapons, drove the Hyksos out of Avaris, and hunted them into Palestine. The gates were closed, but the Egyptian mind had changed forever. The desert was no longer a shield, it was a highway for invaders. To survive, Egypt had to control the lands where threats were born. This was the birth of the new kingdom. The pharaoh was no longer just a shepherd, he was a professional general. Egypt turned its society into a permanent war machine, marching north into Syria and south into Nubia to create a buffer zone. At this height of power, two titans defined the era. Hatshepsut chose wealth over war, reopening trade routes to the land of Punt and flooding Egypt with exotic gold and myrrh. But her successor, Thutmose III, the Napoleon of Egypt, brought the sword. Through 17 relentless campaigns, including the tactical victory at Megiddo, he pushed the empire's borders from the Euphrates to the deep south. Egypt was now the undisputed superpower of the Mediterranean. But this openness to the world brought more than wealth. It brought dangerous new ideas that would lead to the strangest revolution in human history. Under the Sun King, Amenhotep III, Egypt reached its geopolitical zenith. Gold was so abundant it was said to be as common as dust. But this wealth created a state within a state, the priesthood of Amun. They controlled so much land and treasure that they began to rival the pharaoh's own authority. The counterattack came from his son, Akhenaten. His religious revolution, replacing the old gods with the solar disk, the Aten, was a calculated political strike to shatter the priesthood's power. He built a new capital in the desert and seized the temple's wealth. But while Akhenaten focused on theology, the empire began to fray. Vassals in Syria were swallowed by the rising Hittite Empire, and the king's isolation left Egypt vulnerable. After Akhenaten's death, the experiment collapsed. The boy king Tutankhamun was forced to restore the old gods, and the military eventually seized the throne. This gave rise to the Ramesside Dynasty, a line of generals obsessed with restoring Egypt's military prestige. The peak of this era was Ramesses II, the Great. He faced the Hittites at the Battle of Kadesh, the largest chariot battle in history. The thundering collision of thousands of war machines ended in a stalemate, leading to the world's first recorded international peace treaty. Ramesses II spent the rest of his 66-year reign building megalomaniac monuments like Abu Simbel to project a power that was becoming increasingly rigid. Beneath the surface, the machine was stalling. The temples again owned a third of the land, the army depended on foreign mercenaries, and the bureaucracy was bloated. While Egypt celebrated its glory, the world outside was changing. A wave of droughts and migrants was about to shatter the Bronze Age, and Egypt was on a collision course with the greatest catastrophe of the ancient world. As the second millennium BCE ended, the world around Egypt disintegrated. The Bronze Age collapse, a perfect storm of drought and famine, toppled every major power in the Mediterranean. Egypt was the only superpower to survive the storm, but the cost would ensure it never regained its former glory. The threat came from the waves, a mysterious confederation of invaders known as the Sea Peoples. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought the last great defensive stand in pharaonic history, ambushing their fleet in the delta's narrow canals. Egypt won, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. The war emptied the treasury, and international trade, the state's lifeblood, lay in ashes. In the village of Deir el-Medina, hungry tomb builders organized the first recorded strike in history. By the 20th dynasty, royal authority evaporated. The high priest of Amun controlled more land and wealth than the pharaoh, shattering the country into the third intermediate period. As Egypt tore itself apart, a new power rose from the south, the kingdom of Kush. These Nubian kings saw themselves as the true guardians of Egyptian tradition. The Black Pharaohs of the 25th dynasty launched a holy war to save Egypt, reunifying the land and sparking a cultural renaissance. But this rebirth attracted a new, brutal predator, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This was a technological execution. While Egypt relied on bronze, the Assyrians fought with the cold efficiency of iron. In 663 BCE, the unthinkable happened. The Assyrians sacked the holy city of Thebes, dragging away its sacred obelisks as trophies. The Kushites were driven south, and Egypt was left in ruins, ruled by foreign puppets. The era of absolute autonomy was over. Egypt was entering its late period, a sunset age where survival would depend not on its own strength, but on the dangerous skill of negotiating with the rising empires of the world. The sack of Thebes wasn't the end. In a final display of resilience, Egypt reinvented itself under the Sate kings. Pharaoh Psamtik I realized that to survive, he needed to embrace the world. He hired Greek and Carian mercenaries, bronze-clad hoplites, to unify the land. This reopened Egypt to the Mediterranean, injecting silver and trade into a resurgent economy. This Sate Renaissance was fueled by a powerful nostalgia. Artists and priests deliberately copied the styles and spells of the pyramid builders from 2,000 years prior. It was a political shield. By reviving the forms of their glorious ancestors, the Sate pharaohs were claiming the legitimacy of the gods, dressing a modern, multicultural state in the sacred robes of the past. But the geopolitical tides were shifting. In 525 BCE, the Persian Empire arrived. At the Battle of Pelusium, Egypt was defeated and turned into a satrapy, a mere province of a Persian world. Egypt became a breadbasket for Persepolis, its wealth drained to fuel a foreign throne. The Egyptian spirit made one final stand. In 404 BCE, a successful rebellion launched a 60-year window of independence under the 30th dynasty. The last native pharaohs, like Nectanebo II, began a frantic program of temple building and fortification, racing against time. They used the cult of sacred animals as fierce markers of national identity against the rising eastern tide. In 343 BCE, the nightmare returned. A massive Persian invasion shattered the delta's defenses, and Nectanebo II fled south into Nubia. He was the last native Egyptian to ever rule the Nile. When Alexander the Great arrived a decade later, he was welcomed as a liberator, not a conqueror. He was crowned pharaoh, but the existential cost was absolute. For the next 2,000 years, the Nile would be ruled by foreigners. The arrival of Alexander the Great in 332 BCE was a radical rupture. Egypt was no longer ruled from its ancient heartlands, but from Alexandria, a Mediterranean megaport facing the Greek world. Alexander won the people by embracing their gods, even trekking to the Siwa oasis to be declared the son of Amun. To the Egyptians, he was a liberator. To history, he was the architect of a new, hybrid world. After Alexander, his general Ptolemy I turned Egypt into a vast private estate. The Ptolemies perfected the centralized state with corporate efficiency, replacing barter with coins and imposing monopolies on everything from oil to beer. This created a two-tiered society, a Greek-speaking elite in Alexandria and an Egyptian majority laboring in the fields. To keep the peace, they built magnificent temples like Edfu and invented a hybrid god, Serapis, to bridge the gap between Zeus and Osiris. Technologically, Egypt surged. Innovations like the Archimedes screw pushed irrigation further than the floods ever could. But this glittering wealth masked internal rot. Extreme taxation triggered the Great Revolt of Thebes, where native kings reclaimed the south for 20 years. Though the rebellion was crushed, the dynasty emerged weakened and fractured by bloody family feuds. The final act belonged to Cleopatra VII. Unlike her predecessors, she learned the Egyptian language and presented herself as the living incarnation of Isis. Her gamble was the ultimate political play, aligning with Rome's titans, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, to preserve Egypt's autonomy. But the game ended at the Battle of Actium. With her defeat and tragic passing in 30 BCE, the era of the pharaohs reached its definitive end. Egypt became the personal property of the Emperor Augustus, a strategic breadbasket province to feed the Roman masses. Under imperial rule, as Christianity spread, the old rites were silenced. When the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae in 394 CE, the ability to read the ancient texts vanished. The sovereign political entity born with Narmer 3,000 years prior had dissolved. The ecological cage of the Nile had forced the creation of a monumental civilization, and its immense wealth had finally attracted a world that consumed it. The cycle that began in the Green Sahara was now extinguished.